You're listening to the podcast of High Rock Acton, where we seek to connect to God personally, to God's people, and to God's purposes. You can join us every Sunday at 10 a.m. and learn more about us at highrockacton.org.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Will. I'm one of the pastors at our church. And if this is your first time here, I'm especially glad you're here. I hope after the service we have a chance to connect and get to know one another. I'll be hanging out kind of in the lobby after church. For those who've been journeying with us, I mentioned recently about how in November, I was poked in the eye and I suffered what I found out later was a major corneal abrasion. What I didn't tell you is that right after it had happened, Becky and I had the same conflict that we have every time an injury happens in our home. Becky's first response is, let's go to the emergency room now. We got to give this thing attention and fix it. And my first response, even though I'm in agonizing pain, I can barely even see out of one eye, is let's not go to the emergency room. I'll probably be fine. I know it may seem like I've lost my vision, but do you remember, Becky, how much it cost us last time we went to the ER? Just looking at all the zeros in that bill made me go blind in both eyes. As much as I wanted healing, I instantly started counting the cost. And it's not just me, I do that with, when Rosemary, she crushed her finger in our front door and it was like hanging by a thread, and Becky goes, to the emergency room now. And I'm like, it's still kind of on there, just let's get a little tape. Aiden fell down our front steps one time and a brick punctured his head and like blood was spurting out of this hole. And Becky's like, to the emergency room. And I'm like, can you hand me the glue? Right, don't get me wrong now, I think I'm a good dad. I want everyone in my family to be healthy and whole. But something deep within me rises up and strongly objects to going to the ER or the doctor because it costs so much time and so much money. I want wounds to be healed. I want broken things in our world fixed. I want the plight of the poor to be relieved. I want the injustices of our nation to go away so the playing field is level again. I want that hurting and lonely friend of mine to find life again. I want the children in Congo to have an emergency room within walking distance. I want more people around me to be touched by God's love at the core of their hearts, of their anxiety, and be transformed. I want my heart to experience that more. But all of those things are costly. And I can't help but hesitate when I start counting the cost. We've been looking at the book of Ruth over this past month. For those unfamiliar with it, it's the plight of two women whose lives have been just broken down. They both lost their husbands and homes. Both of Naomi's sons have died. Her daughter-in-law, Ruth, is childless. Things are so broken in their life that Naomi says, call me Mara, which means bitter. But the short story is that how God is still working no matter what the circumstances, and how God steps in and transforms bitterness to sweetness. But the real thing we've been looking at is how God does that. You see, there's no thunderbolt or miracle out of nowhere that just solves everything. Rather, God transforms the bitterness of our lives through the everyday miracle of everyday people living out God's great love in everyday ways. That is the great story that we have the privilege to be a part of. And so we've been seeing how this love kind of is fleshed out in the book of Ruth. We've learned about God's chesed, his covenant loyalty and faithfulness. We looked at how Ruth lives out that chesed by promising to stay with her mother-in-law no matter what, in sickness and in health, in plenty and in want, until death do them part. In chapter 2, we encountered Boaz, this wealthy landowner and relative who practices chesed by showing kindness to these two hungry widows when they need food the most. And then we learned last week that God's blueprint for Israelite society included this role of the goel, the redeemer. When someone had lost their claim on their land, lost their husband or spouse, lost their children and heirs, when someone had kind of just lost a future, a relative would be called to step in and take up the responsibility and privilege of redeeming what was lost. And so now we're in chapter 4. We pick up the story. Boaz knows the circumstances. He knows his cousin Elimelech has died, and he, Boaz, has the opportunity to be a redeemer, to buy back Naomi's land, to marry Ruth, and produce children with her so that the whole family legacy can live on and everything that was lost can be saved. He knows all that, but before he can step in and be a redeemer, this little wrinkle in the story emerges. There's another kinsman, a cousin, who's kind of actually closer in line. And so this guy actually has the first dibs as the redeemer. And so it was Boaz's responsibility to talk with this guy first. And the scripture that Gabby just read for us is mainly a dialogue between Boaz and this other family member about who's going to be and what it takes to be a goel, a redeemer. Now, if you've been tracking with us, you've noticed that in every in every chapter, there's been a key word or a name that the drama hangs on. And in this chapter, the word that is most frequently used in the Hebrew is quanah. I'm not really sure if that's how it's pronounced, but I'm just saying it with authority. Quanah. It means acquire, buy, purchase. Now, here's always a good question to ask when you look at any story in the Bible. Why, of all the fascinating parts of the story of transformation of lives that the person could zoom in on, why does the narrative zoom in on the details of this conversation and transaction between Boaz and this other guy, we don't even know his name, that ends with them handing each other a sandal? Like, we know Boaz is going to end up redeeming things, so why is ink wasted on this other guy and the logistics of all this buyback process? I think the reason the narrative slows down and zooms in here and contrasts this guy and Boaz, it's in order to illustrate that this work of redemption is always costly. To be a person, to be a church whom the living God uses to redeem, restore, and rescue the lives of others, it requires that we not only count the cost and pay attention to it, but then willingly embrace it, pay it, all for the sake of redemption. That's what this story wants to invite us into. So Boaz meets with this other potential redeemer kind of at the center of town where everyone is there and watching. And he tells the circumstances to him first, that Naomi's land is going to be lost, and then we need someone to buy it, so their mutual cousin Elimelech, who they know from childhood, so that his whole estate, his family, can have a future. And this guy's a decent guy. He cares about people. And so without hesitation, he says, I will redeem it. Let's do this. I can rescue the situation. Let's fix this thing. Do you ever have that gut instinct when you see someone hurting and there's a problem and you're just moved to say, hey, how can I help? Let me fix things. I can help rescue you. But to be moved in your heart is one thing. It's another thing altogether to be moved into action and to move into someone else's life and get involved deeply. And so the story starts to show us that redemption, it goes beyond good intention and that immediate feeling of, I want to be helpful. So the conversation continues. Boaz says to the guy, great, I'm so glad that you want to redeem. It's a package deal though. So let me explain what you're getting with your new land. Once you agree to be Naomi's redeemer, not only do you get all of her land, but you're responsible to marry her daughter-in-law Ruth and then try to have kids with her so their family legacy can live on. And as you know, any kids you have with her, then they get to receive all of your inheritance, just like the children you already have. In other words, you're committing to share your estate for generations to come. In fact, your estate will probably be divided up among everyone in this new, bigger family of yours that you're embracing. Isn't this awesome? And all of a sudden, this guy who was just seconds ago so willing to redeem, eager to redeem, something rises up with him and strongly objects. And he says, Boaz, let's not go to the emergency room. I know people are hurting, but let's not go there. I can't redeem this family story because I might endanger my own estate. I care a lot about other people, but the stuff and the people I care about most might be put into danger. Do you know that? How can I give my kids everything if I have to have other kids and give them some of it? How can I give my work everything if I now have to give this woman attention and time? You see, he starts to begin to count this cost of redemption. And suddenly it seems so way out of his price range. The price was right. When I was paying for land that would kind of enlarge my own estate, that kind of sounded good. The price wasn't so right when it meant investing in people who would demand my time and divide and use up the resources of my estate for years to come. I think there's a deep lesson in that response that touches so many areas of our lives. Ministry, it's not something you step into to enlarge your reputation and your name for yourself. Marriage is not something you step into to enlarge your income and just to make your life better. Friendship is not something you step into in order to enlarge your social network. Parenting is not something you step into in order to enlarge your warm and fuzzies in your heart and fill up your photo album. Giving to the poor and the powerless is not something you do in order to put selfies on Facebook about your generosity. All kinds of relationships do have great benefits, often to our own lives, but all require an outpouring of sacrificial love. Where you give, you decrease. You don't make it about your name so that others might increase, so their name can be lifted up. You see, this guy who's an ordinary good guy, he steps back from the role of redeemer, not because of the one-time financial cost, but because of the long-term relational cost that will affect not just his checkbook, but every aspect of his life for years to come. Yet Boaz, he's willing to pay this high cost of redemption. Why is that? I think the answer is not anything profound. It's actually what we've been saying all series long. It's not because Boaz or any of the characters in the story are exceptional people. Rather, it's because Boaz worships, loves, serves, and is in faithful relationship with an exceptional God. And he just wants to reflect the one he knows best. You know, there's this Christian band I grew up listening to called Third Day. They're kind of like a Christian version of Hootie and the Blowfish. All right, that wasn't funny. I thought it would be good. Okay. But Third Day has this one song, and it's kind of written as a love song from God to us. And of all their songs, its chorus has always stuck with me. It's spoken kind of as God's words to us. Just to be with you, I'd do anything. There's no price I would not pay. Just to be with you, I'd give anything. I would give my life away. You know, there is this long-standing tradition, way of speaking about God. It started in the Hebrew scriptures and becomes even clearer in the New Testament. This theme that God's redeeming love for us is costly. It costs God a great price, a personal price, to stretch out and be intimately involved in our lives, to change and redeem the course of our lives. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, he keeps saying to us, you were bought at a great price. You have life, you have new life, because God paid a great price. What does that mean? Well, as we kind of read the story of God in the New Testament, we get an image of the life of God that the church has been drawing kind of new life from for years. So I just want to paint that image a little bit. At the center of reality is God, the one who created us, the maker of heaven and earth. But this God who created us is not a solitary figure. Rather, God at the very core is a Father and a Son, and their shared dynamic spirit of love. And this love is thick. It's unbroken. It's full. It's abundant. It's like gathered around the table, and there's just laughter and food and fun. You never want to leave that table. Everything God needs for life is right there. There is no lack. Yet the story goes that the father and son, as they're caught up in conversation around the table, they decide together to interrupt their fellowship. And the father instructs the son to go leave the house. And the son packs up and willingly goes on a mission. He goes down from heaven, down to earth, into a foreign land, a place. It's a place where he will suffer from hunger, from thirst. He'll feel what it means to be human. He'll feel the effects of human sin. He'll know what it's like when someone's rage and anger, when the tables of injustice are turned against you. He'll get nailed to a cross. He'll go to the deepest darkness where there's nothing. Why in the world would a father instruct his son to go there? What kind of son would leave that house to go to such a dark place? You see, as father and son were around the table contemplating their life, their shared life, and as sweet and full as that fellowship was, they were moved by compassion for all of us who they created. And saw so many people who don't have a table where they are filled up and filled with love. They saw the bitterness, the empty hands. So many people in need of love, and they said, it is better to give up this. The Father, it's better to give up my one and only Son than live another day here without all of those home. So the Father instructs his one and only Son to leave, go on this mission, not to leave the Father's love, the Spirit is always with Jesus, but to leave the comfort of their heavenly home and in the power of their Spirit and the power of love to go and rescue us. Go take on their flesh and all of its awkwardness and restriction. Get in their shoes and love them in ways that they can see and recognize and take a hold of. Take off their shoes and wash their dirty feet. Show them what real love looks like. Go stand in the thick of all their judgment and anger and bitterness towards one another. And when they start throwing stones at you, show them that grace and forgiveness and turning the other cheek, that it wins and that my love is bigger. Go face that enemy death that we are all so afraid of. Go battle it for them, defeat it. Do everything it takes to demonstrate that my love is stronger than the grave. That's the command. The Father sends his own Son on a rescue mission that will cost them their everything. Just imagine that. In order to redeem us, to bring us home, the estate, the household of God is fundamentally changed. Just to be with you, I'd do anything. There's no price I would not pay. Just to be with you, I'd give anything. I would give my life away. The Father and Son risk everything in order to go bring us home and adopt us into the family so that we can have a life forever that we don't deserve. That's a special kind of love. One of the well-known criticisms of kind of America's own legislators is that they authorize wars that they're unwilling to send their own sons and daughters to. So I was moved recently when I heard Vice President Joe Biden share about his son Bo, who had died of brain cancer earlier this year. In 2008, Bo grew up in this wonderful home, and by 2008, he was a successful lawyer, and he was elected as the Attorney General of Delaware. His prestigious position. He had a beautiful family. His father, of course, was a state senator who at this time was running for vice president. Yet for all of his fortune and power, Bo was also committed to serving and fighting for freedom. So he joined many years ago the National Guard and said, I'm going to serve with you guys. He didn't need to, but he believed in it. Literally the day after Joe Biden got up and had that vice presidential debate, Sarah Palin, we've all tried to forget it. Instead of sitting beside his dad and kind of enjoying all the power and accolades and kind of excitement of that moment, Bo responded to the call of his unit to be deployed to Iraq. So Bo went, and it wasn't some cush job. He risked danger to serve. I was thinking about what's interesting is how his dad experienced this. His dad, who had so much power and sat among those who made that very decision to send our troops. On that day, he said this about it. He goes, I really don't want him going. I don't want my son going. But I tell you what, I don't want my grandson or granddaughters going back in 15 years. And so I get why it's important. How we leave, what we do there, it makes a big difference. I forget the politics behind all of that. What just kind of spoke to me is that this dad, as much as he loved his son, he had a heart for the big picture. He was thinking about the future for his grandchildren, for the next generation. He could see how badly a need and remedy for a broken situation, how much that was needed. And because he had that larger vision of what was happening, he was willing to let his son go, even to legislate it. You see, the sacrifice, the risk was worth it because it helps buy the chance for redemption in a very broken situation. To be used by God as redeemers, it requires that we are honest and count the cost, but that we learn to count it in the way God does. In fact, Jesus commands it. He famously says, hey, if you're going to set out on a big mission to build something, you got to count what that's going to take. You know, a person who goes around with kind of good intentions to help, who's always like, hey, yeah, let me know what I can do for you, but hasn't thought through the cost enough to live those out, they can't do too much in God's kingdom. We're invited to live into the story of Boaz, to live into this story of redeeming love, and to do that, we need to realistically count and accept and embrace the cost. The question is, how do we do that? Especially if you're like me, and even something as natural as bringing my own kids to the ER brings hesitations and worries about what it's going to cost me. I think the answer is that we need the faith, the ability to see value and to count cost in the way God sees cost and value. I'll explain what that means. In his book, Simplify, by Bill Hybels, the ladies in our kind of Friday women's group are studying it. Hybels gives an example of kind of what counting the cost in the way God does, what it looks like. He tells a parable about two friends and followers of Jesus named Mike and Jim, both trying to figure out how to plan kind of out their lives and their resources. It's a parable about money, but it holds true for every area of our lives. So first there is Jim, and Jim says, hey, Mike, I really need to get from point A to point B in life. And it's going to require, in order to get there, 100% of my time, all my resources and earnings to get there. It's simple math, the calculations work. For me to get from A to B, I need to invest 100% of everything I have. And he looks at what he has and he's like, man, I just have enough. This is just enough to get me to point B. Mike looks at things differently. He says, Jim, I get that. I need to get from point A to point B too. But I believe that God can take me from A to B on less. On just 90% of my time, my resources and earnings. And I'm going to give the 10% of my time, my talents, my treasures, I'm going to give those directly to the purposes of God, because that's a pattern I see in this story of Scripture. And I believe that there's something to that. That when I do that, God will not only take me from A to B, but from point B to point C as well. You see, Jim, God promises that we have this glorious inheritance in Christ, that there's an overflowing of blessings. He talks about the riches of his kingdom, about eternal treasures. I think that's over at here at point C, and I want to take God up on that and learn to experience that. Hybels says this, that new place C, it isn't even on Jim's radar. It's not on most of our radars. He's doing simple math, normal counting, but his roadmap, his journey for life, it ends at B. But Mike, he sees in this story of God, the story of redemption, this other point C, that's a place of true blessing and favor and living into God's story, the place where you're connected to God's purposes and part of his great redemption. Mike doesn't know exactly what C will look like, but he has a hunch it will be far more exciting and rewarding than ending his journey where everyone else does at point B. Often when the chance to live out redeeming love comes up, we count the cost in terms of kind of our regular math, and it's not worth it. And that's because we're only thinking about getting here in life. I'm thinking of things like protecting my estate, securing my own family. How do I get from A to B? But everything changes when we learn to value C, that place God's inviting us. We also, when we think about our decisions and how we get involved, we need to count the cost of losing what we could be a part of if we don't take the risk of making ourselves available for God to bring us over to point C. Those things God wants to do in and through us that are beyond all we ask or imagine. That place when we step out in faith and say, God, I know you've called me and chosen me, and you want to do something for me, and I just want more of your love, and I want to share more of it with this world. Have you counted the cost of not participating in that? You might miss out. It's true not just in terms of finances, but in every area of our life. Being a part of God's redemption story is costly, but when we have eyes and imagination for it, how can we choose anything else? Heibel shares this story about a time he experienced what this looks like, where he kind of just tried to stay open in this posture of paying the cost to get to point C in his life. He was once in a busy coffee shop writing his weekly sermon. He was just there kind of doing his thing, but he kind of looked up and noticed it was really full and the waitress was just so stressed out. And Heibel in that moment felt the Holy Spirit kind of give him a little nudge and say, hey, stop writing your sermon, being so focused on what you're doing. Take a page of that and write this lady a note of encouragement. It's like, all right, sounds like you, God, sounds like a thing you would say. So he starts writing her a note and words of encouragement. But as he wrote that note, he felt this other prompting. Bill, I also want you to leave her a breathtaking tip. So he asked God, well, what's your idea of breathtaking? Like 30% of my coffee? $4? So now Heibels was starting to wrestle with it and count the cost. God nudged him again and said, Bill, leave her $100. That doesn't make sense. It took his own breath away. But because he was in that place of wanting to be part of the more that God is doing beyond what he can see or imagine, he finished that note, put $100 inside. I guess some pastors have $100 in their wallet. I might give her a McDonald's coupon, I don't know. Put that $100 in, left it on the table, left the coffee shop trusting that God's at work. Didn't hear anything from it. Some weeks later, he was in his normal routine back in that coffee shop again. Waitress was there and she just kind of ignored him. But near the end of the meal, she just slipped her own note on his table and said, read this later. This is what that note said. You will never know what your note and gift last month meant to me. That morning, my husband served me with divorce papers. He controls all our money and he took all of our money and our only car. That day was one of the worst days of my life. And then I found your note and your gift. And it reminded me that God is faithful and God will take care of me. Because one person was willing to count the cost, like God the Father counts, like Boaz counts. He was able to go from B to C and experience God work in ways he couldn't calculate or imagine. Redemption is costly. But when we count that high cost and pay it and embrace it, we get to be a part of God's story of redemption. You know, I've mentioned throughout this series how important names are in the book of Ruth. And one of the most interesting things in this chapter is that this other relative who chooses not to redeem, he's never named. In fact, when the text refers to this guy, the best translation is Mr. So-and-so. He's just kind of your Mr. So-and-so, wealthy guy who's making sure all of his assets were protected, his inheritance passed down, and he's not remembered. But Boaz, an equally ordinary guy with some wealth, but who uses his assets to protect others, to give others an inheritance who didn't have one, his name is part of the story. And we'll look at this next week, but that is a legacy that lasts forever. What might it mean for you today to count and embrace the cost of living into God's story of redemption? I think a lot of it not only begins here, it begins here with vision, with cultivating an ability to value what God values. So maybe your first step today is just making the investment, the sacrifice of spending more time in God's story, reading God's story of redemption, praying into it. And then as you do it, read the news, dig for the underreported stories of the many people in our world who are just longing to be redeemed. And then start asking God, hey, how can you take me to point C, where your love just breaks loose and does all kinds of things? High Rock's a network of churches, and one of my friends, Pastor Josh at High Rock Brookline, he has an 87-year-old neighbor whose wife died a few years ago. And this neighbor has just been in mourning and grief. And so the Thronberg family, they did what the nice stuff, like, hey, let us know how we can help. Here's a card. And that is all good stuff. But as they prayed over it, they said, let's do more. And they scheduled a weekly dinner with their neighbor every single Thursday night. See, they gave their neighbor a family that he no longer had. And so he comes over every week. They break bread around the table. They laugh. They have a story together. They share love. So Josh's kids, they know him so well, they call him Grandpa Al. There's so many creative ways to live into God's redemption story. They all are costly, but we'll never be ready to pay that cost until we develop a vision for redemption and get a sense for how sweet it can be.